The pineal gland is a small gland that's hanging from the roof of the third ventricle, and it's named pineal because a scientist thought it looked kind of like a pineapple. It contains the cells called pinealocytes, and those secrete melatonin. And melatonin is the same kind of chemical that you can buy at GNC. It's the chemical that's released in response to darkness. So you can kind of think of it as our own natural physiological version of Ambien. So melatonin may affect several different things. It affects the timing of sexual maturity, puberty. It affects our day-night cycles. So one of the difficulties in going from day shift to night shift worker has to do with the melatonin released. But it also controls other variations in the body as well. So let's look at some of the specific other endocrine organs besides the pineal gland. And we can see them shown here. So the pineal gland is the first one that we see on this diagram, hanging from the base of the third ventricle, produces melatonin. Then we have the hypothalamus, which you've learned now is a neuroendocrine gland. Part of it secretes action potentials and part of it secretes hormones. And then the pituitary gland has two parts to it, the anterior and posterior pituitary gland. There's the thyroid gland, which secretes two hormones. The main one is the thyroid hormone, the other is calcitonin. Then on the posterior aspect, the dorsal aspect of the thyroid gland is the parathyroid glands, which produce parathyroid hormone, which have the most largest effect on calcium. The thymus produces thymosin, helps T lymphocytes to mature. You've learned about the adrenal gland now with the cortex and the medulla. So next we're going to talk about the pancreas. And the pancreas has two different populations of cells. And the pancreas is a mixed organ or mixed gland. And it's called mixed because it has both exocrine and endocrine portions. The exocrine portion produces an enzyme-rich juice for digestion that's released into the small intestine. And the endocrine portion is the pancreatic islets, also called the islets of Langerhans. And the two populations of cells are the alpha cells and the beta cells. The alpha cells produce glucagon, and that's what we call a hyperglycemic hormone because it raises the blood glucose level. Whereas insulin produced by the beta cells is a hypoglycemic hormone, lowers blood glucose, released right after we eat a large meal. So glucagon is a potent hyperglycemic agent. It's going to be triggered when blood glucose levels drop. And what happens is it's going to target the liver to first break down glycogen into glucose. This process is called glycogenolysis. And it also produces glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, and that's called gluconeogenesis. So on this slide, we can see the photomicrograph of the islet cells, and it's a very small portion of the pancreas. It only makes up about 2% of the pancreas, but has a very important function. And the rest of the cells are exocrine. So the other major hormone produced by the pancreas is, of course, insulin. And it's secreted when the blood glucose levels increase. So after absorbing a large meal would be an example of when that happens. So it lowers the blood glucose in several different ways. It allows the glucose to be transported into fat and also muscle cells. It triggers the breakdown of glycogen to glucose. It inhibits the breakdown of glycogen to glucose, inhibits the conversion of amino acids or fats to glucose. So these two processes right here would occur because of glucagon, not insulin. So let's look at the other factors responsible that occur from insulin release. So the primary stimulus is elevated blood glucose levels. So again, after eating a large meal. Also rising blood levels of other fuels. If they were amino acids or fatty acids, it also triggers insulin to be released. Another factor that causes insulin release is our rest and digest nervous system, which, recall, is the parasympathetic fibers, and that those release acetylcholine. So hormones glucagon, epinephrine, growth hormone thyroxine, and glucagon also affect insulin release and inhibit it. The same with somatostatin and the sympathetic nervous system. So our next slide shows the feedback loop that's occurring here. So let's look at the feedback loop that occurs after eating a large meal. In that case, the first thing that happens is that blood glucose levels increase, and so now the system is in imbalance. So if the pancreas is working properly, insulin should be released from those endocrine cells, those islet cells, and that stimulates glycogen formation. So we have this extra glucose that we want to put into storage. So this process happens in the liver. Then glucose is going to be taken up by the tissue cells and stored, thus lowering the blood glucose in the body, in the blood. So it's a negative feedback system that reverses the stimulus. So the response is a decrease in blood glucose. On the other end of the spectrum, if we have low blood sugar, so what should normally happen is the pancreas should secrete glucagon. And remember, glucagon is a hyperglycemic hormone because it's going to raise blood glucose. This causes glycogen to be broken down into glucose, a process that happens in the liver, and this raises blood glucose back to normal levels. So on this slide, we see insulin, which is the hypoglycemic hormone, and we see glucagon, which is the hyperglycemic hormone that is shown here.